These urban reforms were taking place across the Soviet Union during the leadership of Khrushchev. He followed Stalin to power, and he was very much against the Stalinist style of architecture and urbanism, which he found rather grandiose but not particularly useful. And so he famously denounced Stalin in one of his speeches in the mid-1950s, and then he proceeded to encourage architects to work on a new style of housing, fabricated housing for the masses, really, so that large areas were built with apartment blocks. And his driving concept was to have a family, to have an apartment for every Soviet family. Here we can see in the poster that this is indeed happening, and we have this lady who looks really quite Western. You see that it's quite Western. She's wearing this beautiful Chechen dress, and she's throwing open the windows to her new apartment. And across the road from her, another block of flats is going up, and yet again are at work. And there is the crane, which is sort of symbolic of this new socialist utopia that is being built. And it was claimed that by the mid-1960s, almost half the population of the country had moved into these new apartments. However, there were some downsides also, because the apartments were built really very fast, and they were, as I said, made up of prefabricated parts, and so they were quite quick to deteriorate, and they're also really very small, so that by that same period, a Soviet citizen would have about 40% less space than their Western counterpart. The difficulties that Khrushchev encountered in his drive to overtake capitalism was the fact that the design industry in the Soviet Union was very much underdeveloped, because consumerism had not been encouraged under Stalin. For example, the main department store, which was in Moscow, had been closed during Stalin's reign, and it was reopened again during Khrushchev's regime. To be able to produce a lot of consumer goods for the new flats that they were building, the Russian designers had to seek some inspiration from the West, and so quite a few objects in the exhibition resemble their Western counterparts. And this radio was supposed to have been copied from a French one that was brought back by a Soviet diplomat in the mid-1950s. And so it resembles its French counterpart, but it does have a red star here at the top. And we also have a motorcycle which is called the Avoska, but which is bearing a very close resemblance to the Vespa, the Italian Vespa. And because of the specificities of the Soviet Union and the colder weather than the Mediterranean climate, the Avoska did not end up having as much success as the Vespa, sadly, because it was too cold to ride about for most of the year. Other objects were inspired really by Russian traditions or by local customs. So, for example, the Nevalashka dolls, they were first created in the 19th century. They were used to be made of wood, and they are quite similar to the matryoshkas, except that they stand alone and they do not fall if you push them, because they have a weight at the bottom. So they are considered to be very safe, and small children can play with them. They're very engaging, but they are at the same time quite safe. And they were redeveloped in the 1950s when there was a drive to create new educational toys, and there was even a toy institute that was researching the production of toys in the city of Avoska. We have in the exhibition 4 different types of nevalashkas, which are made of plastic, as they were now made in the 1950s when they were redeveloped. And you can see how they're all different shapes, and so the prototype was taken by different factories, and they were given a makeover according to the individual designers of the factories. And the interesting fact is that because of this new drive for consumer products, the new products were given to different factories, creating rather odd synergies. So the nevalashkas, for example, were given to a gunpowder factory, and they continue to make them even today, and they make about 35 different types of nevalashkas. One particularly Soviet object in the exhibition is this dial-less telephone. And the dial-less telephone was a direct line to the Kremlin, and so it was very, very prestigious. But at the same time, I imagine it would have been quite stressful, because you were directly at the beck and call of Stalin and then later Khrushchev. And the dial-less telephone would have been in the office of military commanders or factory directors, and the ringing of it would probably strike fear in their souls as they knew that they were being summoned by the Kremlin. Beauty products also benefited from the new consumer drive, and they were not seen as having a bourgeois stigma anymore. Perfume, for instance, became quite popular with the rise of new synthetic ingredients, and the 7-year plan, in fact, encouraged the chemical industry, which allowed perfume producers to produce perfume that was not luxury anymore. And so the New Dawn factory, for instance, became very well known for its products, such as the Stone Flower perfume, which was very popular, and it came in this rather decadent Fabergé-inspired box. And another product was called the Tale of Tsar Sultan, and as you can tell from the name, it was inspired by old Slavic folklore. And the bottle itself, the bottle stopper, was shaped like a kokoshnik, which is a traditional type of headwear in Russia. And another product called Red Moscow, in fact, is still the range is still going today, and it's very, very popular. And here we can see a rather beautiful little powder box and a soap from the Red Moscow range. And ironically, the Red Moscow perfume was first developed by a French perfumer for the Tsarina. And even though later on the same recipe was reused, now the Soviets, they claimed that their perfumes were much better than the French products, and they were quite proud of their achievement. If you could afford to buy a whole bottle of perfume, you could go to GRAD, the department store in the center of Moscow, and you could be squirted with perfume by a machine where you paid 10 kopecks, and then you could smell quite lovely all day long. And this new interest in fashion also showed in the fact that the government invited Christian Dior to show their new look collection in 1959. And the Christian Dior models actually got to spend a whole week in Moscow, and they were wandering around the streets. They were photographed in the streets of Moscow wearing this beautiful fashion, in contrast to the local population who was looking at them and slightly bewildered, I suppose. And women who were very interested in fashion had quite a difficult time, because even though they could see the Christian Dior models, for instance, they couldn't really buy them in the shops. And so for that reason, items such as this sewing machine are very popular as well. This sewing machine is, in fact, has an electromechanic drive, so you can plug it in. And this was seen as quite an advancement. Obviously, it made life much easier for the woman who had a family, perhaps had children, and had to look after them and her husband. And such a sewing machine would have been quite an investment for a family, because the one we have here, we actually have the receipts from the store, and it cost about 300 rubles, which at the time would have been about 3 times the salary of a person for 1 month. So your vending machines didn't just squirt you with perfume, they could also provide you with refreshment. And this was a very popular soda dispenser, and for 1 kopeck you could get plain soda, and for 3 kopecks you could get additional lemony tasting syrup. This was very popular, and it was a bit of a national sport trying to get the soda for free, especially if you were to hit the machine in the right place. That could literally provide you with a free glass of soda. And this was a much beloved sport by children to try out. But of course, most mothers would prefer to forbid their children completely from using it, because it was not very hygienic. So you would get just 1 glass for the machine, and the glass would be sitting here. And once you've had your drunken fill of the wonderful soda, you would have a fountain that would squirt water, and you could append your glass and clean it, and then leave it there for the next person to come and use it. In the exhibition, we also focus on one example of a Soviet factory, which is the so-called ZIL Automobile Factory, still in existence today. And the factory itself really followed all the vagaries of the 20th century that the Russians also enjoyed. So to begin with, the factory was opened by a wealthy merchant family in the days before the revolution, and once it was nationalized in 1918, it was quite a difficult period, and it was only in 1924 when they produced really the first automobile that they were quite proud of, which was a truck, which was pretty much a copy of a Fiat model. But the truck, which you will see here as a model, was paraded on the streets of Moscow, and everyone was so impressed that that day was declared the birthday of the Soviet automobile industry. The years that followed were again quite difficult for the factory, which didn't produce a lot, in conjunction with the difficulties that the entire economy was following in the wake of the Civil War. But in the late 1920s, a new manager came to the helm of ZIL, and he was named Ivan Lihachev, and he was there for about 30 years, and he completely revolutionized the factory. The factory began producing limousines, which became quite famous because they were favored by Soviet party members and by Stalin himself, apparently. And during the war, they even continued to develop such limousines. And in 1945, on Victory Day, one of the limousines was paraded, and it was said that they were so confident that the war would be won that they were already preparing for peace. And so they had built this new limousine for Stalin. And from this early period of the factory, we have also some great documents. For example, the certificates that were given to workers who were performing particularly well. And here we have one, which is from 1934. And you can see how it's quite elaborate, really, and it still has the iconography with Stalin and also with Lenin here at the top. Whereas this certificate from 1944, during the war period, is concentrating more on the efforts of the factory's workers who are perhaps at the front or who are involved in the production of military equipment. And something else really quite interesting are these tickets that were given again to workers who performed particularly well to go and see the parades that were taking place in Red Square in the 1940s, and particularly in 1945, to celebrate the victories in the war. And we can see here two such examples, and the parade would have taken place just in Red Square, past Lenin's mausoleum, and also where the groom department store is. And we can see here that this particular person would be sitting, with her bed sitting quite near the groom, in the section that was near the groom. Because of this great success that the factory was now having, it was renamed after Stalin, and so it was called ZIS, Zavod imenia Stalina, the factory named after Stalin, which is its literal meaning. And it continued to produce both trucks and buses and automobiles, but also in the 1950s it branched out into domestic items such as refrigerators, because again this was the party politics of the time, and the consumer goods drive also impacted them. And the factory was then making a quite famous refrigerator, which was branded after the factory name, which was by now called ZIL, because again Stalin had fallen out of favor, and the factory was now renamed after Lihachev, its director for 30 years, and so it was called Zavod imenia Lihachev. In the 1960s, the factory again developed along the lines of Khrushchev politics, and so almost like a mini village was built for the workers. So they all had their own apartments, they had facilities like creches for the children, and everyone was very much living very proud to work with ZIL and to have such a good workplace in such great conditions, including, for example, a special resort that was reserved for ZIL employees in the Crimea. But as conditions in the country then began to worsen in the 1970s and 1980s, all these areas, they really lost their brand new shine, and the buildings which had been built quite quickly because of the mass housing drive, they began to deteriorate, and these areas were not quite so prestigious anymore. And finally, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, really the death knell for ZIL was when Yeltsin, the then president, decided to use a Mercedes as his personal car rather than a ZIL limousine according to tradition. And ZIL is now still in existence, but the site is going to be probably redeveloped in the near future. I was speaking earlier about the ZIL refrigerator, and here it is. It's on all its glory. And this particular model that we have here is the 100,000th ZIL refrigerator that came off the production line. And this is the reason why we have it, because it was kept at the factory who kindly lent it to us for the exhibition. And the ZIL refrigerator became quite an object of desire for the Soviet consumer, because it was not so widely available, and it was termed really the Rolls-Royce of refrigerators because of its connection with the ZIL Automobile Factory. And it had lovely touches such as the handle, which is the handle of the ZIL limousine. And so you can open the fridge just as you would open your limousine, and again inside it's really quite beautiful, and it has a ZIL brand, which is quite prominently displayed. And to begin with, even though it was obviously quite desirable, it wasn't a very obvious choice for the Soviet consumer to make. And there are stories about people who made a special trip to Moscow just to buy a refrigerator, take it back to their town, for their neighbors to be quite bewildered as to why they would need one, especially into the mid-50s, because it was quite cold outside, so a lot of people really just kept their foodstuffs outside when they needed to preserve them. And so there was even a satirical cartoon that referenced the ZIL refrigerator, which showed it sitting on a balcony in the snow, quite lonely. And this was sort of showing how it was such a status symbol that people wanted to display it, so they would put it outside on their balcony. But obviously it wasn't really needed because it was very cold, so the refrigerator was really superfluous, but very beautiful and very desirable. These rather strange objects are vinyl discs made using medical x-rays, and this practice happened really in the late 1940s, when the regime was at its harshest, and Russian dissidents, in order to listen to Western music such as perhaps jazz or foxtrot or even Elvis Presley, would make copies of Western records that were forbidden using medical x-rays. And I guess it must have taken some experimentation before they discovered that this was the ideal material that they could use in order to make copies. But even this was really not perfect, because the grooves that could be made into the x-ray material were quite shallow, so the records could only be played for a limited number of times, which I guess made them even more desirable and exciting. They could be quite expensive. In the late 1940s, a special laboratory producing them was opened illicitly, of course, which was called the Golden Dog. So that's where you would go and get your forbidden music from. They really fell out of favour in the early 1960s with the development of the cassette player, when people could just record. It was much easier to record, obviously, from one cassette to another. We also have here quite an interesting object from the same in the same vein, but this one doesn't seem to have been made on an X-ray. It portrays Stalin being a little bit dismissive towards Khrushchev. It's obviously a record that contains a satirical poem of some sort, which purports to be spoken by Stalin towards Khrushchev because of his rather more permissive attitudes and because of the thaw period. These beautifully accurate models of ZIL cars and trucks and vans that we have here were in fact made in China. In the 1950s, ZIL had developed so much that they were quite prestigious, and they were invited by the Chinese government to help them set up their first car factory. And many of their workers were trained by ZIL managers, including one of the future presidents of the Chinese Republic. And as a gift, the Chinese gave ZIL back very accurate models of all the models that they had ever produced in the history of the factory. In 1959, the American exhibition opened in Moscow, and so Soviet consumers were suddenly exposed to a whole range of goods that they weren't even used to. And the American exhibition became quite famous because of the debate that occurred between Nixon and Khrushchev on camera. And it became known as a kitchen debate because it took place in the model American kitchen, and it sort of became symbolic of all the things that the Soviet housewife could not have compared to her American counterpart. Of course, Khrushchev was very proud of the Soviet Union's achievements in the space race, because in 1957 the Sputnik had been launched, which was the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth. This blue tin, for instance, celebrates Yuri Gagarin's first flight into space. He was the first man to fly into space, and on the Vostok shuttle, and so you can see here the word Vostok inscribed in the shuttle as it flies off into space. And so Khrushchev's argument to Nixon really was that the Soviet was superior to the US in terms of technology, but of course this was of no use to the man in the street. And so a whole new bevy of products appeared that were directed at the Soviet housewife, and were also somewhat space age-inspired in order to create this idea that all this new knowledge and all this research could now benefit the ordinary person. And this gave rise to some rather wonderful objects, such as this vacuum cleaner, which is called Saturnus, and it's actually shaped like the planet Saturn. It even has a ring around it, and it's quite nifty with its little handle, and it came in quite a wide variety of colours as well. And it was, in fact, quite closely based on the Hoover Constellations model, but it also has really quite nice Russian-inspired touches, I think. And the other one was the tricolor, the seagull, which is shaped like a rocket. And even something like a samovar could be slightly Sputnik-inspired with this rather lovely globular shape. And even though it is quite intricately designed with a slightly old-fashioned model on the surface as well, so it really brings the old and the new together. And of course, it was a samovar, but it was also electric, so you could plug it in and make your tea, which was unusual. And many people who moved into these new apartments and brought these new consumer goods would not have had access to a running water or electricity beforehand, so it really was something quite novel. And housewives now even had small portable radios that they could carry in their handbag, which is rather delightfully described here in this image on the instruction manual of the radio. Now, of course, these goods were not immediately adopted by everyone, and in fact, there are many stories about mothers-in-law thinking that the vacuum cleaners were really just helpful, work-shy housewives. But soon they became quite desirable, and the only people really left to convince were the naysayers who thought that some of the more decorative features of these objects were really taking up too much material that could be used in different ways. So, for example, the tripod was criticized because it had these sort of wings alongside, which were not really necessary for the vacuum cleaner, but added a lovely decorative touch. Despite the growing number of consumer goods, Soviet culture was still very much a culture of shortages. And so if you were not a party member, for instance, you quite often had to go around carrying one of these. This is a string bag which was named an Avoska, after the word avos, which is sort of the equivalent of perhaps or maybe. So one could say this was a just-in-case bag, and because it was so easy to carry and to fold up, you could just have it in your pocket, and if you bumped into a queue, you would join it, and then really just wait and see what there was to buy. And quite often people just join the queues anyway, even though what was on sale perhaps they already had and they didn't really need it. But one could always trade objects that one had too many of with their neighbours and obtain something else in exchange. So the Soviet consumer culture really had its own peculiarities. The range of Soviet consumer goods also expanded to include children's toys, and there were still quite clear gender differences in that the boys, for example, would get one of these rather elaborate electronic kits in order to practice being the engineers of the future, and they could learn how to construct electronic circuits, for example. Whereas the girls would replicate what they saw their mothers doing, and they would be encouraged to buy the new domestic appliances, but in miniature. And they were really quite beautifully done, that you can see how the fridge here even has a freezer compartment. And the washing machine is a miniature version of one of the earlier examples of washing machines that still had a manual rigger, and which resembled in their design a rocket, because space age, of course, space age design was very much in favor at the time. And later on in the 1980s, video games became quite popular as well, such as this handheld video game, which was based on a really famous New Pagadi cartoon of the bunny and the wolf. And in fact, if we talk about video games, Tetris was also invented in Russia in the 1980s.